Hey guys, before we wander into one of the coldest nights a medieval village could ever face, take a quiet moment to settle in. Maybe dim the lights a little, get comfortable beneath your blanket, and if you're enjoying these peaceful journeys through history, consider leaving a like, subscribing, and telling me where you're listening from. It's always comforting to imagine people from every corner of the world drifting off to sleep beneath the very same story. Now, let your breathing slow. Imagine the warmth of your room fading, just enough for your mind to step somewhere else. Close your eyes and listen carefully, because tonight, there are no heated homes. No electric lights glowing against the darkness. No weather forecasts warning you that the worst winter in decades is about to arrive. Only silence, only snow, only the long, endless night. You wake before dawn in a tiny medieval village somewhere in northern Europe. Outside your wooden cottage, the world has disappeared beneath layer after layer of fresh snow. The familiar footpaths are gone. The fields that fed everyone through summer now resemble an endless white sea stretching toward forests hidden beneath icy mist. Even before opening the door, you can feel the cold pressing through the timber walls. It has a strange weight to it, almost as though winter itself is leaning against your home. Patiently waiting for someone to make a mistake, the wind whistles through tiny cracks between rough wooden boards, carrying tiny crystals of snow that glitter briefly in the weak firelight before melting on the packed dirt floor. You pull your wool cloak tighter. It helps, but only a little. The oldest people in the village have been whispering for days. They've watched the clouds. They've studied the flight of ravens. They've noticed how strangely quiet the forest has become. Even the wolves have stopped howling. To them, these are signs, not of magic, but of experience. Long lives have taught them that nature often grows strangely calm before revealing its harshest face. Outside, smoke rises lazily from dozens of chimneys, climbing into a pale gray sky that never seems to brighten. Every family is already awake, not because they are eager to begin the day, but because sleeping too late means losing precious warmth from the fire. Children carry small bundles of sticks almost as carefully as treasures. Parents glance toward the forest with worried eyes. Grandparents sit close to the flames, conserving every movement, every breath, every ounce of energy. No one speaks loudly. Winter has a way of softening every voice. Food has already become more precious than coins. Firewood is measured almost like gold. Even candles are burned sparingly, their tiny flames protected from every careless draft. Life itself begins to move more slowly, not from peace, but from necessity. You quickly realize that surviving here isn't about strength alone. The strongest farmer can freeze just as quickly as the smallest child. The richest household can watch its supplies disappear just as surely as the poorest. Winter doesn't bargain. It doesn't notice titles, or wealth, or pride. It simply arrives, and waits. As daylight struggles to reach the village, neighbors quietly help one another reinforce doors with straw, patch tiny holes in walls using mud mixed with animal hair, and carry water before the wells begin freezing around the edges. No one knows exactly how cold tonight will become, but everyone senses that this night will be remembered. Not because of a battle, not because of a king, but because ordinary people will simply try to stay alive until sunrise. As the pale afternoon slowly slips toward another long darkness, the entire village begins making silent preparations for the coldest night anyone can remember, and that is where our journey truly begins. The afternoon slips away almost unnoticed, not because the sun has already set, but because it never truly seemed to rise. A pale, silver light hangs above the village like a worn piece of cloth, offering little warmth and even less comfort. Shadows stretch softly across the snow, blurring the outlines of cottages until the entire settlement feels as though it is slowly disappearing into winter itself. The quiet has changed. Yesterday, it was peaceful. Today, it is watchful. Every villager seems to sense that this evening will test them in ways no ordinary winter's day ever has. There are no bells ringing to announce danger. No messenger arrives with alarming news. The warning comes from something much older than words. It lives in the ache of tired bones, in the strange heaviness of the air, and in the way experienced eyes keep drifting toward the northern horizon. The oldest shepherd quietly shakes his head. "I've felt this cold before," he murmurs. No one asks when, no one needs to. His expression says enough. Across the village, every household begins moving with careful purpose. Doors are opened only for moments before being closed again with firm hands, trapping whatever warmth still lingers inside. Loose straw is packed into gaps beneath thresholds. Thick wool blankets, stitched together over many winters, are hung across doorways to slow the icy drafts that slip through the smallest cracks. Even children understand the seriousness of the evening ahead. Usually, laughter echoes between the cottages before sunset. Tonight, they help in silence. Small hands carry peat, dried moss, and bundles of kindling almost too large for their arms. Every stick matters. Every handful of fuel may become another precious hour of warmth before morning. Outside the blacksmith's workshop, the last sparks rise into the grey sky. His forge, normally alive with the sound of hammer striking iron, grows quiet earlier than usual. There is little reason to shape metal tonight. Iron tools can wait. Cold cannot. The baker removes the final loaves from his oven while there is still enough heat left in the stones. The scent of fresh rye drifts gently through the frozen air, comforting everyone who passes, even if only for a moment. Bread baked today must last longer than anyone wishes. Nearby, women fill clay pots with thick cabbage stew, barley porridge, and whatever salted meat remains from autumn. The meals are plain, but filling. On nights like this, food is measured not only by taste, but by how long it helps the body hold its warmth. The village priest walks quietly from house to house. He offers no grand speeches, only gentle words, a reassuring smile, a hand resting briefly on a worried shoulder. Faith, like fire, is something people hope will last until dawn. As daylight fades even further, the livestock begin to sense the change as well. Chickens settle unusually early upon their roosts. Sheep crowd close together inside low stone pens. Dogs refuse to wander far from their owners, their noses lifted toward a wind-carrying scents from distant forests now buried beneath snow. Even the horses seem restless. They stamp slowly against the frozen ground, clouds of warm breath rising into the still air before vanishing almost instantly. No one ignores these quiet signs. Generations have learned that animals often notice danger long before people do. Beyond the village, the forest stands perfectly still. Its ancient pines wear heavy coats of snow that bend their branches toward the earth. Not a single bird calls from within the trees. The silence is so complete that every distant creak of frozen wood echoes like a whispered warning carried through the wilderness. As evening settles, families gather everything they may need before darkness fully arrives. Buckets of water are brought indoors before they freeze solid. Lanterns are trimmed carefully to conserve precious oil. Extra cloaks are laid beside sleeping places. Wooden shutters are checked once, then checked again. No one wishes to step outside once night claims the village. Inside each cottage, flames flicker gently against rough timber walls. Their light dances across tired faces, revealing worry hidden beneath calm expressions. Parents exchange quiet glances when children are not looking. Grandparents remember winters they rarely speak about. Young couples silently wonder whether the supplies they saved will truly be enough. The wind begins softly, barely noticeable at first. Just a quiet breath brushing against the rooftops, then another, and another, each one a little colder than the last. The fire crackles, the walls groan. Outside, fresh snow begins drifting across the empty paths, covering footprints made only an hour earlier, as though the village itself is slowly being erased. No one knows exactly what the coming darkness will bring, but every family understands one simple truth. Once the doors are barred and the night fully arrives, there will be no turning back, and somewhere beyond the frozen forest, winter is still drawing closer. Night arrives without ceremony. The last traces of grey daylight quietly disappear behind thick clouds, and the village is swallowed by a darkness unlike any other season. Snow continues to fall, not in wild, blinding sheets, but in slow, patient flakes that seem almost gentle. It is a beautiful sight, until you remember what waits beneath that beauty. Inside the cottages, every family has gathered close to the fire. No one lingers outdoors now. The heavy wooden doors have been barred. Shutters are fastened tightly. The world beyond the walls has become a place of silence and uncertainty, where every step through the snow costs precious warmth. The wind begins to find its rhythm. It whistles softly around the corners of each cottage, slipping through tiny cracks that no amount of straw or wool can completely seal. Every faint draft brushes across cold fingers and tired faces, reminding everyone that winter is always searching for a way inside. The fire answers with a gentle crackle. Its orange glow dances across rough wooden walls, offering comfort that feels almost fragile. Every log placed onto the flames is carefully chosen. Too many at once, and the firewood may not last until morning. Too few, and the room begins surrendering to the cold. Outside, the temperature falls even further. The snow beneath the moonlight no longer looks soft. It sparkles like crushed glass, each tiny crystal reflecting the pale light of a sky filled with distant stars. Beautiful, but merciless, an old hunter, unable to sleep, quietly lifts a corner of his shutter and peers outside. The air itself seems frozen. There is no movement, no owl gliding between the trees, no fox crossing the fields. Even the forest appears to be holding its breath. He closes the shutter without a word. He has seen nights like this before, and he knows that they rarely end without sorrow. Across the village, the youngest children sleep wrapped beneath layers of rough wool blankets, tucked close beside their parents. The elderly remain awake longer, not because they wish to, but because age has taught them how dangerous these hours can become. They listen to every sound the house makes, every creak of frozen timber, every sigh of the wind pressing against the roof. It is impossible to know whether the walls will endure until dawn. The cold has a peculiar way of changing ordinary things. Water left too near the doorway develops a thin layer of ice before midnight. Leather boots become stiff. Wooden buckets crack without warning. Even the simple act of breathing feels different. Each breath carries a sharp chill deep into the lungs, making the warm air inside the cottage seem more precious than ever. Beyond the homes, the wells begin freezing around their edges. The narrow stream that supplied fresh water throughout autumn grows slower with every passing hour. Thin ice quietly spreads across its surface, sealing the gentle current beneath a sheet of glass like frost. Nature itself begins to pause. For those living through it, this is no ordinary winter evening. It is survival measured 1 hour at a time. The village healer moves silently between two neighboring cottages, carrying a small lantern whose flame struggles against the wind. She has been called to comfort an elderly man whose breathing has grown shallow. there is little medicine she can offer. A warm blanket, hot broth, gentle company, sometimes that is all anyone possesses. As she returns home, her footprints disappear almost immediately beneath fresh snow. By morning, it will seem as though no one walked there at all. Inside another cottage, a young father quietly checks the fire again, not because it needs tending, but because watching the flames gives him something to do besides worry. His wife notices. She says nothing. Instead, she gently places another log beside the hearth for later, carefully saving every piece. No one speaks of fear aloud. Speaking it somehow makes it more real. Instead, families whisper about spring gardens, lambs yet to be born, and the warmth they hope will someday return. These conversations are small acts of courage, tiny reminders that winter, no matter how cruel, cannot last forever. Yet beyond the warmth of those flickering fires, the cold continues its patient advance. It seeps beneath doors, it settles upon rooftops, it hardens the earth beneath the snow, and somewhere in the endless darkness, the first signs of true danger begin, not with a roar, but with a quiet, unnoticed chill creeping into places where warmth once lived. By the time dawn finally arrives, some families will awaken grateful for another day. Others will discover that winter has already begun collecting its price. Morning comes, but it brings little comfort. The darkness retreats only enough to reveal a world that has grown even whiter than the day before. Snow clings to every rooftop, every fence, every bare branch reaching into the pale sky. The village seems frozen in place, as though time itself has slowed beneath the weight of winter. Inside your cottage, the fire still burns, barely. A bed of glowing embers waits beneath a blanket of ash, carefully protected through the night. Losing that fire would have meant starting again with frozen hands and damp tinder, a task that could take precious hours. You stir the coals gently, a small flame appears, everyone breathes a little easier. But warmth, true warmth, never really arrives. Medieval homes were built to endure the seasons, yet even the strongest cottage had its limits. Thick oak beams supported the roof, while walls of woven branches covered with clay and straw offered some protection against the wind. During ordinary winters, they were enough. Not this winter. Today, the cold feels almost alive. It slips through tiny cracks hidden between wooden boards. It creeps beneath doors worn smooth by countless footsteps. It settles quietly against the stone foundation before rising into the room like an invisible tide. You cannot see it, but you feel it everywhere. The packed earth beneath your feet is icy to the touch. Even inside the house, a thin layer of frost sparkles across the corners where the morning light reaches the walls. Water stored in wooden buckets wears a skin of ice despite never leaving the room. The air smells of smoke, damp wool, and cold timber. It becomes impossible to forget that outside these fragile walls lies a world capable of taking every ounce of warmth away. The roof offers little reassurance. Bundles of dried thatch, carefully laid during warmer months, now sag beneath the growing weight of snow. Every few hours, someone must step outside with a long wooden pole to knock loose the heaviest drifts before the roof begins to strain. It is dangerous work. The wind bites exposed skin within moments, yet leaving the snow untouched could be worse. A collapsed roof in the middle of winter is more than an inconvenience. It is often the beginning of disaster. Children are instructed never to wander near the doorway without permission. Each time the door opens, a wave of freezing air rushes inside, chasing the warmth toward the ceiling before swallowing it completely. So every journey outdoors is carefully planned, one trip for water, one for firewood, no unnecessary steps, no wasted energy. Even windows provide little comfort. Many cottages have no glass at all. Instead, wooden shutters close tightly against the night. while thin sheets of oiled cloth or stretched animal hide allow only the faintest hint of daylight to enter. The rooms remain dim, shadows linger long after sunrise, yet perhaps the greatest challenge is not the house itself, it is the constant battle to keep hope alive within it. Every family understands that the walls surrounding them are imperfect. They know the cold will continue finding its way inside hour after hour. Still, they mend another crack, they hang another blanket, they push another bundle of straw against the draft. These small acts are less about defeating winter and more about refusing to surrender. Across the village, neighbors quietly share advice learned from parents and grandparents. One family recommends stuffing dry moss into gaps between logs. Another spreads fresh rushes across the floor to insulate bare feet from the frozen ground. Someone else hangs thick wool cloaks over sleeping areas to trap what little warmth remains during the darkest hours. None of these solutions are perfect. Together, they make survival just a little more possible, as afternoon fades once again. Smoke curls steadily from every chimney that still has fuel to burn. From a distance, the village almost appears peaceful, but behind each wooden door, people are constantly listening for the groan of roof beams, listening for the crack of frozen timber, listening for the unsettling silence that comes when a fire begins to fade, because in a medieval winter, a home is never truly a fortress, it is only a fragile shelter standing between human life and a cold that never grows tired. As another evening slowly settles over the snow-covered rooftops, every family turns its attention toward the glowing hearth, knowing that before this endless winter is over, keeping a single fire alive may become the hardest task of all. The evening arrives quietly, snow gathers along the edges of rooftops, and the village slowly disappears beneath another layer of white. From a distance, the cottages appear peaceful, their chimneys releasing thin trails of smoke into the frozen air. But inside those small homes, another struggle has begun, a struggle against something invisible, something patient, something that can enter through the smallest opening and steal away the warmth people depend on, the fire. For a medieval family trapped in the heart of winter, a hearth was not simply a place to cook food. It was the center of survival itself. It provided light when darkness filled the room. It offered a little comfort against the cold. It allowed people to prepare meals, dry clothing, warm tools, and gather together during the longest nights. Without it, the cottage became little more than a wooden shell surrounded by ice, so every family watched their flames carefully, almost constantly. Inside one small home near the edge of the village, a farmer kneels beside the hearth, carefully moving pieces of wood into place. He does not simply throw another log onto the fire. Every movement is calculated. The largest pieces are saved for the deepest hours of night when temperatures fall the lowest. Smaller branches are used when only a little warmth is needed. Even ashes are protected because they help preserve glowing embers beneath the surface. The goal is not to create a huge roaring fire. That would waste too much fuel. The goal is to keep a small, steady flame alive until morning, a flame that breathes, but does not consume itself too quickly. Children learn this lesson early. They are taught never to leave the hearth unattended. They know that a single careless moment could scatter burning embers across the floor or allow the fire to weaken beyond recovery. The youngest villagers may not understand the dangers of winter completely, but they understand the importance of the fire. They see it in their parents' faces. They feel it when the flames grow smaller. As the night deepens, the household becomes organized around this simple source of warmth. The person closest to the fire shifts position carefully, allowing others a turn near the heat. Damp gloves are placed beside the flames. Wet pieces of wood are moved closer to dry slowly. A kettle hangs above the embers, its gentle steam briefly softening the cold air. Every small action matters. Even the arrangement of sleeping places depends on the hearth. Beds are positioned as close as possible without creating danger. Thick blankets are layered together. Wool clothing is often worn while sleeping because removing it would mean surrendering precious body heat. The fire does not make the room warm, not truly, it simply makes the cold bearable. Outside, the wind grows stronger, it pushes against the walls and sends faint whispers through the gaps in the timber. Each gust reminds the family that their little circle of warmth exists only because they continue protecting it. In another cottage, an elderly woman tends the flames with the experience of many winters behind her. Her hands move slowly, but confidently. She knows the sounds of a healthy fire, the bright crackle of dry wood, the quiet hiss of damp branches, the soft collapse of glowing embers. To an inexperienced person, they might all sound the same. To her, they tell a story. A fire speaks if you know how to listen. She notices when the flames begin shrinking too quickly. She notices when smoke changes direction. She notices when the room feels colder despite the fire still burning. Generations of knowledge have taught her these small signs, not written in books, not recorded by scholars, passed from one winter survivor to another. As midnight approaches, the village grows silent. Inside every cottage, similar scenes unfold, hands carefully tending flames, eyes watching glowing embers, families quietly hoping that the fire will last just a few hours longer. Because winter survival is not always decided by great events, sometimes it depends on something much smaller, a single spark. A single piece of dry wood, a single flame refusing to disappear. But as the night continues and the frozen days ahead begin to demand more than anyone expected, another problem slowly approaches. The fires are burning, the families are surviving, but the stacks of wood outside the cottages are beginning to shrink, and soon, the village will have to face a difficult question. What happens when the fire still burns, but there is nothing left to feed it? The morning arrives slowly, not with the cheerful sounds of birds or the busy movement of villagers beginning their daily work, but with the quiet crackling of exhausted fires and the soft footsteps of people stepping carefully across frozen ground. Another night has passed, another night survived, but as families open their doors and look toward the woodpiles beside their cottages, a new worry begins to spread. The stacks are smaller, much smaller, throughout autumn. Villagers had spent countless days cutting trees, splitting logs, and dragging heavy bundles back home. Every family knew winter would come. Every family prepared as best they could, but no one truly knows how much cold they will have to endure. A normal winter might demand a certain amount of firewood, a brutal winter demands far more. And this winter seems determined to consume everything. Outside one cottage, a farmer stands beside his remaining wood pile, counting the logs silently. He touches each piece as if measuring more than wood. Each log represents an hour of warmth, an evening meal, a chance for children to sleep comfortably. A little more time before the cold reaches deeper inside the home. He looks toward the forest. It is only a short distance away, but in these conditions, the journey feels much longer. The snow has buried familiar paths. The cold has hardened the earth beneath it. Every step requires effort, and every trip into the woods carries risk. Still, the fire cannot wait. Across the village, people begin preparing for another search. Axes are sharpened, heavy cloaks are repaired, wooden sledges are brought out from storage. Those strong enough gather together, because cutting and carrying timber alone in deep winter is exhausting work. The forest that once provided abundance now feels distant and uncertain. The trees stand tall and silent beneath layers of snow, their branches frozen and heavy. Finding suitable firewood is no longer as simple as choosing the nearest tree. Freshly cut wood contains too much moisture and burns poorly. The best fuel comes from dry branches, fallen trees, and carefully stored timber collected months earlier. But those supplies are disappearing. The villagers now search for what remains. They look beneath snow-covered branches. They check old storage areas. They gather broken pieces of wood that would have been ignored during easier times. Nothing useful can be wasted. Even small branches become valuable. Inside the cottages, families adjust their habits. Meals are cooked more carefully. The fire is allowed to burn lower during the day. People spend more time wearing their outdoor clothing indoors. The idea of comfort begins to change. Comfort is no longer sitting beside a roaring fire. Comfort becomes feeling your fingers again after warming them. Comfort becomes waking up and finding the embers still alive. Comfort becomes reaching another morning. For elderly villagers, the shortage brings memories of difficult winters long past. They remember years when families burned furniture, broken tools, and wooden household items because there was nothing else left. These stories are not told to frighten children. They are warnings. Winter has always demanded difficult choices, and sometimes survival means giving up things that once seemed important. As the days pass, the village becomes quieter. The sound of axes striking trees echoes less often because fewer people want to venture into the freezing forest. The distance between cottages feels greater, not because the homes have moved, but because everyone has less energy to spare. Neighbors still help one another. A family with extra wood shares a few logs with those struggling. An elderly couple receives bundles carried by younger villagers. A small kindness can mean the difference between enduring the night and facing serious danger. Yet even generosity has limits. A village can only divide what it has, and slowly, everyone begins to understand the same frightening truth. The forests still stand, the snow still falls. The fires still burn, but the supply keeping those fires alive is fading away. Inside each cottage, people begin looking toward the remaining wood piles with a mixture of hope and concern. How many nights are left? How many more storms will come? How long can these carefully guarded flames continue? Because winter is not finished testing them, and the next enemy will not arrive from outside the village. It will come quietly from within their own bodies. The cold that enters through the walls, the cold that settles into hands and feet, the cold that begins taking its first small victory before anyone notices. The cold does not always announce itself with a sudden attack. Sometimes it arrives quietly, a numb fingertip, a strange weakness in the hands, a patch of skin that no longer feels like part of the body. In the frozen world of a medieval winter, these small signs could become the beginning of something far more serious. As the days grow colder and firewood becomes harder to replace, villagers spend more time exposed to the elements. A person may need to walk through deep snow to collect water, repair a fence, check livestock, or search for fallen branches in the forest. These tasks seem ordinary, but in a winter this harsh, ordinary tasks become dangerous. Outside a cottage near the village edge, a young farmer returns from checking his animals. His boots are covered in snow. His gloves are stiff with ice. When he steps inside, his family immediately notices something unusual. He does not remove his gloves, not because he forgot, because his fingers are too numb to move properly. The warmth of the cottage surrounds him, but the feeling does not return immediately. He sits near the fire and waits, hoping the familiar sensation of his hands will slowly come back. This was a moment many medieval people understood well. Cold injuries often began silently. The body tried to protect itself by sending less blood toward the outer parts of the body, preserving warmth for the vital organs. Fingers, toes, ears, and noses were the first places to suffer. At first, the warning signs could seem harmless. The skin might become unusually pale, the fingers might feel stiff, a person might lose the ability to grip a tool properly. Many people ignored these early signals, not because they did not care, but because winter left them with few choices. A farmer could not simply stop working because his hands were cold. A shepherd could not abandon animals because the wind was freezing. A mother could not ignore the need for water because the path to the well was dangerous. Life continued, even when the body begged for rest. Inside the cottages, older villagers shared their knowledge of recognizing danger. They knew that warming frozen hands required patience. Placing numb fingers directly against intense heat could cause pain and injury, so people often warmed themselves slowly near the fire, wrapped in cloth, waiting for circulation to return. The most experienced winter survivors paid attention to the smallest changes. A person who stopped feeling cold was not always safe. Sometimes, it meant the body was becoming overwhelmed. The village healer understood these dangers better than most. She watched for people who became unusually quiet after returning from outside. She noticed when someone moved differently, when their hand shook, or when their skin looked unlike normal. She knew that frostbite was not only a problem of the skin, it was a reminder that the human body has limits, and winter was very good at finding those limits. At night, families became more careful. Children were reminded to cover their hands and feet before leaving the cottage. Wet clothing was dried near the fire whenever possible. Boots were checked and repaired because a small tear allowing snow inside could create serious problems after hours outdoors. Small preparations mattered: a dry pair of socks, a repaired glove, an extra layer of wool. These things could protect someone from a danger they could not always see. Yet even with all this knowledge, winter remained unpredictable. The cold could change quickly. A calm morning could become a dangerous afternoon. A short walk could become longer than expected. A simple task could become a struggle against nature. And as the village continued through the frozen season, people began realizing that surviving winter was not only about having enough food or enough firewood. It was also about protecting the fragile warmth inside their own bodies, because when the cold reached the hands and feet, it was giving a warning, a quiet warning, one that asked a simple question: how long could a person continue fighting the winter before the winter began fighting back? The fire still burns, the walls still stand, but another worry begins to quietly enter the village. It does not arrive with the sound of breaking doors or howling winds. It arrives with an empty space, a nearly empty storage room, a smaller sack of grain, a barrel that feels lighter than it should. For medieval families, surviving winter was never only about staying warm. The cold demanded energy from the body every moment of the day, and that energy had to come from food carefully stored during the warmer months. Summer and autumn were seasons of preparation. Fields were harvested, grain was collected, vegetables were dried, meat was salted, fruit was preserved. Every family knew that winter would eventually arrive, and everything they gathered before the snow was their protection against hunger. But a winter that lasted longer than expected could change everything. Inside many cottages, people begin checking their supplies more often, not because they enjoy worrying, but because counting is sometimes the only way to feel prepared. A mother lifts the lid of a wooden container holding grain. She runs her fingers through what remains, already knowing that each handful must be used carefully. A father checks the storage corner where dried vegetables hang from wooden beams. The supply that once seemed generous now looks smaller beneath the dim candlelight. The food is still there, but winter has a way of making every meal feel like a question. How much longer? How many more days? How many more storms? In ordinary times, a family might enjoy a larger meal after a long day of work. A bowl filled generously with thick stew. Extra bread shared around the table. During the hardest winters, meals changed, portions became smaller, ingredients became simpler, nothing was thrown away. A leftover piece of bread might be softened into soup. Bones might be boiled again to create another meal. Every useful part of stored food was valued. Waste was not simply unfortunate, it could become dangerous. Children often noticed these changes before anyone explained them. They saw fewer pieces of bread placed on the table. They noticed adults quietly giving away their own portions. They learned that hunger was not always a loud feeling. Sometimes it was the quiet moment when someone pushed their bowl toward another person and said they were no longer hungry. Across the village, families depended heavily on one another. A household with extra grain might share a small amount with a neighbor. Someone who had preserved more vegetables might trade with someone who had more dried meat. These exchanges were not about wealth, they were about survival, because in a harsh winter, a village was not only a collection of houses, it was a network of people connected by necessity. Still, there were limits. Even the most generous families could only share what they had, and as snow continued covering the roads and fields, finding additional supplies became almost impossible. The forests offered little, the frozen ground revealed nothing. Markets in distant towns might as well have been on another world. Traveling there meant risking exhaustion, frozen roads, and dangerous conditions. For many villagers, the food stored before winter was the only food they could depend on. The oldest members of the community remembered previous winters when hunger arrived slowly. That was what made it frightening. Starvation rarely appeared overnight. It began with small sacrifices, a smaller meal, a skipped portion, a weaker body, a person becoming too tired to work, and once strength began disappearing, surviving the cold became even harder. The village healer noticed this connection clearly. A person who lacked enough food struggled to fight illness, they struggled to recover from injuries, they struggled to stay warm. The cold and hunger worked together, each making the other more dangerous. As another evening approached, families gathered around their tables with quiet gratitude for whatever food remained. They ate slowly, they spoke softly, they tried not to think too far ahead, because tomorrow was uncertain, the next week was uncertain. Even the end of winter felt impossibly distant, and while the villagers watched their stores becoming smaller, a new danger was beginning to spread through the frozen homes, one that did not care how much food remained, one that traveled silently from person to person, carried not by snow, but by breath. The village grows quieter with each passing day. At first, everyone believes the silence comes from the cold. People spend less time outdoors, doors remain closed longer, neighbors wave from a distance instead of visiting. But slowly, another reason for the quiet begins to appear. Inside the cottages, voices become softer, footsteps become slower, and some fires burn beside people who are no longer strong enough to tend them. Winter sickness has arrived. In medieval times, the cold itself was not the only danger waiting for people. The season created the perfect conditions for illness to spread. Families lived closer together for warmth. Windows remained shut against freezing winds. Smoke from the hearth filled indoor spaces. Fresh food became harder to find, and weakened bodies had fewer defenses. A simple illness could become frightening. A cough that began with one person could eventually reach an entire household. Inside a small cottage near the center of the village, a young child lies beneath layers of wool blankets. Their mother sits nearby, gently placing a cool cloth on their forehead while listening carefully to every breath. The room is quiet, not the peaceful quiet of sleep, the quiet of waiting, waiting to see whether the body will recover, waiting to see whether tomorrow will bring improvement. The village healer visits whenever possible. carrying small bundles of dried plants and traditional remedies passed down through generations. She understands that many illnesses cannot simply be chased away. Sometimes, all she can offer is comfort, warm broth, rest, a clean cloth, a reassuring presence beside someone who feels afraid. These small things matter. Especially during the long darkness of winter, across the village, families begin recognizing familiar signs. A person who once worked all day now remains beside the fire. A strong voice becomes weak and quiet. A healthy appetite disappears. The cold outside seems to enter the body as well, leaving people exhausted and fragile. The hardest part is that winter gives illness fewer opportunities to disappear. During warmer months, people could open windows, spend time outside, gather fresh herbs, and move more freely. Winter removes those choices. The same walls that protect families from freezing winds can also trap stale air inside. The same closeness that keeps people warm can allow sickness to travel more easily. And when several members of a household become ill at once, survival becomes much more difficult. Who gathers firewood? Who prepares food? Who cares for children? Who keeps the flames alive? A family depends on every person having enough strength to contribute. When sickness takes that strength away, even simple tasks become overwhelming. An elderly farmer who once repaired fences and carried heavy loads may now struggle to walk across the room. A mother who spent years caring for others may suddenly need someone to care for her. A child who once ran through summer fields may spend days listening to the wind outside from beneath a blanket. Yet even in these difficult moments, compassion remains. Neighbors leave bowls of soup near doorways. Someone delivers a bundle of dry wood. Another person checks on a lonely cottage where no smoke rises from the chimney. The village understands something important. Winter can separate people physically, but it can also bring them together in ways that ordinary seasons do not. Every small kindness becomes a reminder that survival is not only about personal endurance, it is about connection. Still, as the cold continues and illness moves quietly between homes, some families begin facing a painful reality. Not everyone has the same strength. Not everyone has the same reserves. The very young, the very old, those already weakened by hunger or exhaustion, they face the greatest danger. As another freezing night approaches, the village gathers around its fragile fires, hoping that warmth and care will be enough. But winter has many ways of testing people, and for some, the hardest battles are no longer happening outside in the snow. They are happening inside the walls of their own homes. The winter night stretches on, and within the small cottages scattered across the frozen landscape, one truth becomes impossible to ignore: not everyone faces the cold in the same way. For some, the body carries enough strength to endure the endless darkness, the lack of comfort, and the constant struggle to stay warm. For others, winter becomes a much heavier burden. Among the most vulnerable are the youngest members of the village and those who have already lived through many winters before: children and the elderly. Inside a small cottage near the village square, a mother carefully wraps another layer of wool around her young daughter. The child is not doing anything wrong. She is not careless. She simply has a smaller body, one that loses warmth faster and has fewer reserves to rely on. The cold that feels uncomfortable to an adult can become dangerous much more quickly for a child. This is something medieval families understood through experience. They knew that children needed constant attention during harsh weather. A forgotten glove, a damp pair of boots, a few hours spent too close to an open doorway. Small things could create serious problems, so parents became watchful. Before children stepped outside, clothing was checked carefully. Wool layers were adjusted. Hoods were pulled tightly around heads. Hands were covered as best as possible. Even play changed during the coldest periods. Summer allowed children to run across fields, climb trees, and explore freely. Winter demanded caution. Outdoor time became shorter. Paths were chosen carefully. Adults stayed nearby. The village children still found moments of happiness. Of course, they still smiled when snow covered the rooftops. They still found wonder in frozen ponds and sparkling fields. But winter quietly reminded everyone that joy and danger could exist in the same place. For the elderly, the challenge was different. Many older villagers carried memories of decades of winters. They knew the signs of changing weather. They knew how to preserve food and manage household tasks. Their knowledge was valuable, but their bodies had grown weaker with time. An elderly woman who once gathered herbs from the forest might now struggle to walk through deep snow. An old craftsman who once repaired every tool in the village might now spend most of his day beside the fire, saving his energy for when it was truly needed. Age brought wisdom, but winter demanded strength. And strength was something that slowly faded. Over the years, inside their cottages, older people often became the keepers of stories. While younger villagers worked outside, they shared memories of past winters, old traditions, and lessons learned from those who came before. Their voices carried history. Their experiences helped families survive. Yet everyone understood that they needed extra care, a warm place near the hearth, a full portion of food, a neighbor checking in when they had not been seen. These simple gestures could mean everything. The hardest moments came when several difficulties combined. An elderly person who became sick, a child living in a household with little food, a family trying to care for both while struggling with their own exhaustion. Winter rarely created only one problem. It layered difficulties together until even strong people felt overwhelmed. Still, within these struggles, there were moments of quiet tenderness, a father carrying his sleeping child closer to the fire, a young villager repairing an elderly neighbor's roof, a grandmother telling stories beside the hearth while children listened beneath blankets. These moments were not dramatic, they were simple, human. They showed that surviving the cold was not only about resisting nature, it was also about protecting one another. As the frozen season continued, every family began thinking carefully about those who needed the most help, because while the firewood could be counted, and food supplies could be measured, the value of a person could never be calculated. And soon, another difficult choice would face the village: the animals that provided food, clothing, and labor were also struggling against the endless winter. To survive, families would have to decide how far they were willing to go to protect every living thing beneath their roof. The snow continues to cover the fields, the forests remain silent, and the cold grows so deep that even the animals, creatures built to endure the changing seasons, begin to struggle. For the people of the medieval village, animals are not simply possessions. They are part of the household. They provide milk, eggs, wool, transportation, and strength for daily work. A family's survival often depends on the health of the creatures living beside them. During the harshest winters, protecting animals becomes almost as important as protecting people. Inside the village barns, farmers notice the changes. The animals move less, they gather closer together. Their usual sounds become quieter beneath the heavy weight of the cold. A cow that normally stands calmly in the stable now shivers despite the thick straw beneath its feet. Sheep press tightly against one another, their wool coats covered with frost after brief moments outdoors. Chickens remain hidden in their nesting areas, conserving whatever warmth they can find. The winter does not only test humans, it tests everything alive. For centuries, medieval farmers had learned ways to help their animals survive the cold months. Before winter arrived, they repaired barns, stored extra hay, and created sheltered spaces protected from harsh winds, but a winter this severe could overwhelm even careful preparation. As temperatures fall, some families make difficult decisions. Animals that normally remain outside are brought closer to human living spaces, not because people want the inconvenience, but because shared warmth can save lives. In some medieval homes, especially among poorer families, livestock might be kept in connected areas beneath the same roof as the family. The warmth produced by animals could slightly raise the temperature inside, while humans could protect valuable livestock from freezing conditions. The arrangement was not comfortable by modern standards. The air could become smoky, the smell of animals mixed with the scent of cooking fires. The floors were not always clean, but during the hardest winters, comfort became less important than survival. A warm animal was a valuable animal. A surviving cow meant milk, a surviving sheep meant wool, a surviving horse meant the ability to travel when roads finally opened again. Every creature represented future security. Inside a small cottage on the edge of the village, a farmer checks on his animals late at night. The lantern light reveals a quiet scene. A cow rests on thick straw, chickens remain tucked safely together. A family dog sleeps near the doorway, close enough to protect the home but far enough from the strongest drafts. The farmer runs his hand along the animal's back, checking for signs of weakness. He knows that caring for them now may determine whether his family has enough resources when spring finally arrives. Children often formed strong connections with these animals. They knew individual cows by appearance. They recognized certain sheep by their markings. They understood that these creatures were not separate from village life. They were companions in survival. A child might quietly bring extra straw to a cold corner of the barn. A young farmer might spend hours repairing a broken fence even while exhausted. These actions came from necessity, but also from attachment. Yet bringing animals closer created new challenges. Limited space became a problem. Food supplies had to be divided carefully. Families had to decide how much grain could be spared for livestock when humans were also facing shortages. These choices were painful. A family could not save everything. Sometimes difficult decisions had to be made about which animals could survive the winter and which could not. Winter demanded sacrifices from everyone: humans, animals, the land itself. As another freezing evening settles over the village, the sounds of life inside the cottages become mixed with the quiet movements of animals seeking warmth nearby. The separation between human shelter and animal shelter becomes smaller. Everyone is simply trying to endure, because in a winter this harsh survival does not belong only to those who walk on two legs. Every living creature is part of the same struggle. And as the snow continues falling outside, the village begins to face another frightening reality. The roads are disappearing, the paths are vanishing, and soon, the world beyond the village may become completely unreachable. The village wakes beneath a different kind of silence, not the quiet of sleeping homes, not the peaceful stillness of an ordinary winter morning. This silence feels heavier. It comes from the roads that have disappeared, the paths that can no longer be seen, the distant places that suddenly feel impossibly far away. For generations, villages depended on movement. Farmers traveled between fields and homes. Merchants carried supplies along familiar roads. Neighbors visited one another when help was needed. But winter has a way of changing the shape of the world. A road that once connected people becomes a barrier. A frozen river that once provided a route becomes a dangerous obstacle. A journey that took an hour during warmer months may become impossible beneath deep snow and ice. Outside the village, the landscape no longer looks familiar. Fences disappear beneath white drifts. Small bridges become hidden. Trees stand covered in frost, their branches bending toward the frozen ground. The paths created by countless footsteps are erased overnight. It is as though winter has covered not only the earth, but the memories of how to move through it. Inside the cottages, people begin noticing the changes. The usual sounds of travelers arriving are gone, no carts rolling along frozen roads, no distant voices from passing traders, no news from nearby settlements. The village becomes its own small world. At first, this isolation feels temporary. People assume the snow will stop, the winds will calm, the roads will reopen, but each morning brings another layer of ice, another stretch of frozen ground, another reminder that nature is not finished. The village blacksmith looks toward the road outside his workshop and wonders when he will see customers from neighboring farms again. The baker wonders how long the stored flour will last without fresh deliveries. Families begin checking their supplies more carefully because they can no longer rely on reaching distant markets. Self-sufficiency, something villagers valued during normal times, now becomes a necessity. Every household turns inward. People repair what they can, they reuse what they have. They make plans around the assumption that outside help may not arrive soon. The elderly remember stories from previous winters when villages became isolated for weeks. They speak of storms that buried roads completely, of travelers who became lost only a short distance from home, of communities forced to depend entirely on their own preparation and each other. These stories are not meant to create fear, they are reminders. Winter has always demanded patience, and patience becomes much harder when people feel trapped. For children, the frozen world outside can seem almost magical. They watch snowflakes fall from rooftops. They see the landscape transformed into something unfamiliar, but adults understand what the beauty hides. Snow is not only beautiful, it can conceal danger. A person walking through deep drifts can become exhausted quickly. A frozen river may appear solid but hide dangerous weaknesses beneath its surface. Even familiar routes can become confusing when every landmark is covered, so people stay close. They avoid unnecessary travel. They wait. Waiting becomes a part of winter life, waiting for better weather, waiting for supplies, waiting for the first signs that the world outside is opening again. Yet isolation also creates moments of unexpected closeness. Families spend more time together, neighbors share stories beside the fire, old traditions continue because there is nowhere else to go. The village becomes smaller, but the bonds between people often become stronger. A person who once lived quietly beside others may now depend on them completely. A neighbor's kindness is no longer simply appreciated, it is essential. Still, beneath these moments of connection lies a growing concern. What happens if someone becomes seriously ill? What happens if a roof collapses? What happens if food runs out? Normally, people could seek help. A messenger could ride to another village. A healer could be called from nearby, a cart could bring supplies, but now, the snow stands between them and the rest of the world, and as another storm gathers beyond the frozen horizon, the villagers begin to understand something frightening. The cold is not only surrounding their homes, it is cutting them away from everyone who might help. The snow continues to fall, and with every passing day, the distance between the village and the outside world grows larger. A few weeks earlier, the roads were difficult. Now, they are almost forgotten. The paths that once carried travelers, merchants, and messengers have become hidden beneath layers of frozen snow. The world beyond the village still exists, but it feels strangely distant, almost like a memory from another season. And for the people living through this winter, distance can become dangerous, because sometimes survival depends on help arriving before it is too late. Inside one cottage near the edge of the settlement, a family sits quietly beside their fire. The room is warm enough to be comfortable, but concern fills the air. An elderly man has become weaker over the past several days. Normally, Someone would travel to the nearest settlement and ask for assistance, a healer might come, a relative might arrive, supplies might be delivered, but the road outside has become a wall of ice and snow. The family looks toward the door more often than they would like to admit. Every sound from outside creates a moment of hope, every passing hour creates another moment of worry. This was one of the cruelest parts of severe medieval winters. The problem was not always the lack of knowledge, the problem was the lack of time. People often understood what needed to be done. But winter could make doing it impossible. A messenger could leave with an important message and never arrive. A healer could begin the journey but be forced back by dangerous conditions. A neighbor from another village could want to help but simply have no safe way to reach those in need. The snow decided who could travel and who had to wait. For those waiting inside their homes, the feeling could be overwhelming. The mind begins creating possibilities. What if the storm continues? What if the person does not improve? What if the road remains blocked? Winter created a special kind of uncertainty. A person was not only fighting the cold itself, they were fighting the fear that no one could reach them. Outside, villagers still attempted to help each other whenever possible. Strong travelers checked nearby homes. Neighbors carried small bundles of supplies across short distances. People cleared sections of pathways when the weather allowed. But there were moments when even the strongest efforts were not enough. Nature had its own power, and sometimes it was greater than human determination. The village elder remembered a winter from many years earlier when a family had waited days for assistance after a roof collapse. The community had tried to reach them. They had worked through the snow. They had carried tools and supplies, but the storm kept returning. The story was not remembered because of tragedy alone. It was remembered because it showed how fragile life could become when people were separated from one another. During ordinary seasons, a person might take a nearby village for granted. During a deep winter, that same village could feel like it was across an endless ocean. Yet even in these moments, people continued doing what they could. A neighbor shared a little extra food. Someone gave away a warmer blanket. A family invited an elderly person into their cottage so they would not face the cold alone. Small acts became their own form of rescue, because when outside help could not arrive, people became the help they were waiting for. Still, the harsh winter continued. The roads remained buried. The storms remained unpredictable, and every household quietly hoped they would not face a problem too large for the village to solve. As the nights grew longer and the fires burned lower, another danger began to appear. Not a danger from outside, not a danger that could be seen through the window, but something much quieter, a fear that came when the body grew exhausted. The fire weakened, and sleep began to feel dangerously inviting, because in the coldest nights of winter, even rest itself could become a risk. The night arrives again, slowly, quietly, almost peacefully. The snow outside reflects the faint glow of the moon, and the village rests beneath a blanket of white. From the outside, the cottages appear calm, their windows glowing softly against the darkness. But inside those homes, people understand something that outsiders might never imagine. A winter night was not only something to endure while awake, it was something to survive while sleeping, because sleep brings comfort. But in extreme cold, sleep can also become dangerous. Inside a small cottage near the frozen fields, a family prepares for another long night. The fire has been carefully managed all day, but the flames are smaller now. The remaining wood must last until morning, so the hearth cannot burn as brightly as everyone wishes. The room is warmer than the world outside, but it is not truly warm. Cold air still rests in the corners. The floor still steals heat from anyone standing barefoot. The walls still whisper with the sound of wind moving through tiny cracks. Before lying down, families complete the same careful preparations they have followed for generations. Blankets are layered. Clothing is kept on. Sleeping spaces are arranged close together, not only for comfort, but because shared body warmth can make a real difference during the coldest hours. A child may sleep between parents, an elderly person may rest closest to the hearth. The healthiest adults often take positions where they can help others if something goes wrong during the night. Winter creates its own quiet responsibilities, even sleep becomes something planned. People learn to recognize the difference between ordinary tiredness and dangerous exhaustion. After spending hours outside collecting wood, clearing snow, or caring for animals, a person may feel an overwhelming desire to simply stop moving, to sit down, to close their eyes, to rest. But experienced villagers understood that deep cold could make people less aware of their own condition. A person becoming too cold might feel strangely calm. They might stop noticing discomfort. They might believe they are safe when their body is actually struggling. This knowledge was passed through families. Parents warned children, older villagers reminded younger ones, never ignore the cold. Never separate yourself from the warmth, never assume that one more moment outside does not matter. During these harsh winters, people often woke throughout the night, not because they wanted to, because they needed to. Someone would check the fire, someone would adjust the blankets, someone would listen to the wind and the sounds of the house. A quiet night required attention. Even the smallest change could matter. A fire that had burned lower than expected. A window shutter that had opened slightly, a person sleeping too far away from warmth. The village had learned that surviving until sunrise was not always about facing dramatic dangers. Sometimes, it was about noticing small problems before they became serious. Inside one cottage, an elderly grandmother sits awake beside the dying embers long after everyone else has fallen asleep. She is tired, her eyes are heavy, but she knows the importance of keeping the last coals alive. She gently moves the ashes, a tiny glow appears. Enough, for now. She smiles faintly and adds a small piece of wood, not the largest piece, not the one meant for later, just enough to help the fire continue breathing. Outside, the wind moves across the frozen fields. Inside, the family sleeps. For a few hours, the world becomes still. But winter never truly sleeps. It waits beyond the walls, it waits beneath the snow. And every morning that people wake up is another quiet victory. Yet as the days continue and supplies become increasingly limited, the village begins facing choices that no one wants to make, because sometimes surviving the cold means deciding between two difficult things, two things that both matter, and choosing which one must be sacrificed. The winter does not loosen its grip, instead, it settles deeper. The village has endured the cold, the darkness, the hunger, and the uncertainty. Families have learned to stretch every resource, protect every flame, and share whatever they can, but eventually, even careful preparation reaches its limits. There comes a moment when survival requires choices that no one wants to make, not because people become careless, not because they stop caring, but because winter leaves them with fewer and fewer options. Inside one cottage, a family gathers around the hearth and looks over what remains. A small amount of grain, a few pieces of dried food, a reduced pile of firewood. Everything has a purpose, everything has been saved, yet everything is slowly disappearing. The father looks toward the storage corner. The mother looks toward the sleeping children. Neither speaks immediately. Some decisions are difficult because there is no perfect answer, only choices between what matters most. For medieval families, winter could force painful decisions about food, warmth, and work. Should they burn more wood to keep everyone comfortable? Or save it in case the cold becomes even worse? Should they eat larger meals to maintain strength, or reduce portions to make supplies last longer? Should an adult risk traveling through dangerous snow to search for resources, or stay home and protect the family already there? Every decision carried consequences. A wrong choice could affect not only one person, but an entire household. Across the village, similar conversations take place quietly. Families decide which rooms can be used, which tasks can wait, which possessions are truly necessary. Items that once had personal value begin to look different. A wooden chair might become fuel if the firewood disappears. Old clothing might be repaired again and again. Tools might be traded for food. Things that represented comfort during easier times could become valuable resources during desperate ones. Winter changed the meaning of possessions. Survival gave everything a new purpose. For some families, difficult choices involved animals. Livestock represented future security. But animals also required food. A cow could provide milk in the coming months, but keeping it alive through a harsh winter required valuable supplies. A family might spend hours debating what to do. There was no easy answer. The animal was important. The family was important. Winter forced people to weigh one need against another. These decisions were painful precisely because people cared. A farmer did not see livestock as simple numbers. He knew their habits. He recognized them. He had depended on them through many seasons. Giving something up was never just a practical decision. It was an emotional one. Even within families, sacrifices were often made quietly. Parents gave larger portions to children. The strongest workers continued doing difficult tasks while hiding their own exhaustion. Older villagers encouraged others to use resources they needed themselves. Many people survived winter because someone else chose to go without. These small sacrifices rarely appeared in official records. No kings wrote about them, no monuments were built for them, but they were some of the most important acts in history, because ordinary people endured extraordinary difficulties through patience and care. As another storm approaches, the village gathers around smaller fires and quieter meals. The laughter that filled homes during warmer months becomes less frequent. Conversation becomes softer. Energy is saved, but even in hardship, people continue creating moments of comfort. A story shared beside the hearth, a hand placed gently on someone's shoulder, a child smiling after receiving an extra piece of bread. Winter may take many things, but it cannot completely remove human kindness. Still, the hardest choices often reveal the harshest truth. Not every family has enough. Not every person will make it to the end of the season. And as the coldest days continue, the village begins approaching the part of winter everyone fears most, the moment when preparation, courage, and hope are no longer enough, the moment when some people begin losing the battle against the frozen world around them. The winter morning arrives, but for some homes, the morning brings a silence that feels different. The village has grown accustomed to quiet. Quiet because people are conserving energy. Quiet because storms have blocked the roads. Quiet because the cold has encouraged everyone to remain close to their fires. But this silence is heavier. It is the silence of a cottage where the fire has gone out. The silence of a doorway that does not open. The silence of a family waking up and realizing that someone who shared yesterday's struggles will not share today's. Harsh winters were not only remembered because of the snow, the storms, or the difficult choices people made, they were remembered because of the people who were lost along the way. In medieval communities, winter could become a battle against many dangers at once. Cold weakened the body, hunger reduced strength, illness spread more easily, and when these hardships combined, even a person who had survived many seasons could become vulnerable. Inside one cottage, a family sits close together near a fading hearth. They do not speak much. They have spent the night caring for an elderly relative who grew weaker as the winter continued. For many years, this person had been the source of stories, knowledge, and memories. They knew the best time to plant crops. They remembered old paths through the forest. They had guided younger generations through countless difficulties. But winter does not measure a person by their wisdom, it tests the body, and sometimes the body cannot continue. The loss of an elderly person affected more than one household. It meant losing someone who carried pieces of the past, someone who remembered faces and events that others had forgotten, someone whose stories connected the village to earlier generations. In the same way, losing children brought a different kind of sorrow. Children represented the future. They represented the coming years when fields would be planted, homes would be repaired, and families would continue. Their absence left spaces that could not simply be filled, yet medieval people understood loss as part of life in ways that are difficult to imagine today. Death was closer, families experienced it more often. Communities carried grief together because nearly everyone knew someone who had suffered the same pain. When a person died during winter, the entire village felt the absence. A neighbor who usually carried water was no longer there. A craftsman who repaired tools no longer opened his workshop. A familiar voice that once called across the village path became silent. The missing pieces were noticed everywhere. Even so, winter communities developed ways to remember those they lost. Stories were repeated, names were spoken, small objects were kept. Memories became a form of warmth when physical warmth was difficult to find. People understood that survival was not only about reaching spring. It was also about carrying forward the lives and lessons of those who could not. As the season continued, villagers became more careful with one another. They checked on neighbors more often. They watched for signs of weakness. They shared what little they had, not because they believed kindness could stop winter completely, but because they knew kindness could make suffering less lonely. The snow outside eventually covered many traces of the difficult months. Footprints disappeared. Old paths vanished. The landscape looked peaceful once again. Nature had a way of hiding what people endured, but inside the village, memories remained. The winter would become a story told beside future fires, a story about hunger, about cold, about fear, but also about courage, about people who held on to compassion when circumstances gave them every reason to become hopeless. And as the deepest part of winter finally approached its end, another question remained: why did people fear certain nights more than others? Why did some villagers speak about the longest nights with whispers and old warnings? Because beyond the physical dangers of winter, there was another battle taking place, a battle fought in the imagination, a world of signs, beliefs, and old fears that grew stronger when darkness seemed endless. The winter darkness seems endless. By now, the villagers have learned to measure time differently, not by festivals, not by busy market days, not by the movement of travelers along the roads. They measure it by the length of the nights, by the amount of wood left beside the hearth, by the number of mornings they wake up and find the fire still alive. And among all these long winter nights, some were remembered more than others. The longest nights carried a special weight. They were not only difficult because of the cold, they were difficult because darkness has always encouraged imagination. When the wind moved through the forest, people wondered what sounds were hidden beyond the trees. When strange shapes appeared through falling snow, they searched for explanations. When illness, hunger, and isolation surrounded them, many looked for meaning in the unknown. Medieval villages were deeply connected to stories and traditions passed from one generation to another. Before scientific explanations became common, people often used beliefs and symbols to understand events they could not control. Winter was a perfect setting for these fears. The season itself seemed mysterious. The sun disappeared earlier. The nights lasted longer. The natural world appeared asleep. Animals vanished into hidden places, fields became silent, forests became dark and unfamiliar. Around the hearth, families shared stories during the cold evenings. Some were meant to teach lessons, some were meant to entertain children, others carried warnings about the dangers of wandering too far from home during storms or darkness. A grandmother might tell children not to follow strange lights seen across snowy fields. A farmer might repeat old sayings about changing weather. A traveler might share tales of mysterious sounds heard while crossing frozen forests. Whether people truly believed every story or simply enjoyed telling them, these traditions became part of winter life. They gave shape to fears that were otherwise difficult to explain. The darkness outside was not just empty, it was filled with possibilities. The longest nights were especially powerful because they represented uncertainty. People did not know exactly when storms would end. They did not know whether their food would last. They did not know whether sickness would leave their homes. In a world where so much depended on nature, signs and symbols became important. A sudden change in animal behavior, an unusual pattern in the weather, a strange sound during the night. These things could become part of the stories people carried. Yet these beliefs were not only about fear, they were also about comfort. Rituals and traditions helped people feel connected during difficult times. Lighting a candle, sharing a meal, repeating familiar stories, remembering old customs. These small actions created a sense of order when the world outside felt unpredictable. Inside the cottages, the flames continued to flicker. Children listened closely to stories from older generations. Adults exchanged memories of past winters. For a few moments, the cold outside became less important. The human voice became another source of warmth. The power of these stories came from their ability to bring people together. A village facing a brutal winter needed more than food and firewood. It needed hope. It needed reminders that others had survived difficult seasons before, and sometimes, a simple story was enough to carry someone through another dark evening. Of course, not every belief was harmless. Fear could sometimes make people suspicious. Long isolation could make ordinary events seem unusual. A broken branch in the forest, a shadow passing outside a window, a sudden illness, all could feel more frightening when people were already exhausted and worried. Winter affected not only the body, it affected the imagination. As another long night settled over the village, families gathered close to their fires and continued sharing the stories that had traveled through countless winters before them. Some stories warned, some stories comforted. Some stories simply helped pass the hours until morning, and slowly, as the season moved forward, another feeling began to appear, a quiet realization. The worst darkness could not last forever. Somewhere beyond the snow-covered fields, beyond the frozen rivers, beyond the silent forests, the first signs of change were waiting. But before spring could return, the villagers still had to survive the final stretch of winter, and sometimes, the smallest comforts became the strongest reasons to keep going. The winter has taken much from the village. It has taken warmth from the air. It has taken color from the landscape. It has taken the easy routines that once filled ordinary days. But even after months of hardship, there are still moments when something gentle appears, a small kindness, a quiet laugh, a little warmth shared between people. These moments do not change the winter. They do not stop the snow. They do not magically restore what has been lost. But they remind the villagers that survival is not only about enduring suffering, it is also about finding reasons to continue. Inside the cottages, families begin creating small comforts wherever they can. A mother repairs an old wool blanket that has been used for many winters, carefully stitching each worn section until it can provide warmth for another season. A father carves a small wooden toy for a child who has spent too many days watching snow fall through the window. an elderly villager tells a familiar story beside the fire, not because anyone has forgotten it, but because familiar things feel valuable when everything else feels uncertain. Winter makes simple pleasures feel extraordinary. A warm bowl of soup becomes something to appreciate, a dry pair of shoes becomes a treasure, the sound of another person's voice in the darkness becomes a reminder that no one is completely alone. These comforts may seem small, but during difficult times, small things often carry the greatest meaning. In one cottage, a family gathers around their evening meal. The portion is not large, the ingredients are simple, but before anyone eats, they pause, not because of a formal tradition, simply because they understand that this food represents effort. Someone planted the grain months earlier, someone harvested it, someone carried it home, someone protected it through the long winter. Every meal carries a story, every bite represents survival. Across the village, people continue helping one another in quiet ways. A neighbor leaves extra kindling near a doorway, someone repairs a broken tool without asking for payment, a family invites an elderly person inside so they do not spend another night alone. These actions are rarely dramatic. They do not appear in royal records, they do not become legends, but they are the invisible threads holding communities together. Winter reveals something important about people. When comfort disappears, kindness becomes more noticeable. When resources become limited, generosity becomes more meaningful. When darkness lasts longer, even the smallest light feels powerful. The villagers also find comfort in memories. They speak about summers filled with green fields. They remember harvest celebrations. They remember warmer days when work felt easier and roads were open. These memories are not meant to escape reality. They are reminders, proof that the world has changed before. Proof that seasons always move, proof that winter, no matter how endless it appears, is never permanent. For children, these moments create memories they will carry for the rest of their lives. They may not remember every difficult meal, they may not remember every cold night, but they will remember the warmth of being surrounded by family. They will remember stories beside the fire. They will remember the feeling of belonging, and perhaps that is one of the greatest survival tools humans have always possessed, the ability to create warmth that does not come from flames. As another night settles over the snow-covered village, the fires burn lower but the cottages remain filled with quiet signs of life, a voice speaking softly, a spoon moving against a wooden bowl, a child laughing for a brief moment. The world outside remains frozen. But inside these small homes, human life continues. Still, winter has one final challenge waiting. The coldest days may be nearing their end, but the village has not yet escaped the danger, because surviving winter is not only about making it through the worst nights, it is also about enduring the long wait afterward, when people begin hoping for the first signs that the frozen world is finally beginning to wake. The village has reached a strange moment. The cold is still present, the snow still covers the fields, the rivers still sleep beneath layers of ice, yet something feels different. After months of endless winter, people begin watching the world more carefully. They search for small changes, tiny signs, quiet hints that the frozen season may finally be weakening. For medieval villagers, the arrival of spring was not announced with a single dramatic moment. There was no sudden transformation. Instead, it arrived slowly, almost secretly, a drop of water falling from a roof, a patch of dark earth appearing beneath melting snow, the return of a bird song after weeks of silence. These small signs carried enormous meaning. They represented survival. They meant the world was beginning to open again. Inside the cottages, families still remained cautious. They had survived the worst days, but they knew winter could still return with unexpected storms. A few warmer afternoons did not guarantee safety. A sudden freeze could still damage stored supplies, a late snowfall could still cover the first signs of new growth. So people waited patiently, they watched, they listened. Outside the village, farmers began examining the fields they had not seen clearly for months. The land looked different beneath the melting snow, fences slowly appeared again, old pathways became visible. Tools that had been stored away were brought closer. Everyone began thinking about the work ahead. Spring was not simply a season of relief, it was a season of rebuilding. The animals that had survived the winter needed attention, barns needed repairs, fields needed preparation, supplies needed to be gathered again. The end of winter did not mean the end of struggle, it meant the beginning of recovery. For many villagers, the first signs of thaw brought emotional moments. A farmer might stand quietly beside a field, remembering how uncertain the winter had felt. A child might touch melting snow with curiosity, seeing the frozen world slowly disappear. An elderly person might look toward the sky and remember other winters from long ago. Everyone carried memories of what had happened. The empty storage rooms, the difficult choices, the nights when the fire burned low, the people who were no longer there. The arrival of warmer weather brought happiness, but it also carried reflection. Winter had changed the village, it had shown people their limits, it had revealed how much they depended on one another. During the coldest months, survival had often come down to small actions: a shared meal, a repaired blanket, a neighbor offering help. Now, as the snow began to retreat, those memories remained. The village slowly returned to movement, doors opened more often, people stepped outside without immediately rushing back indoors, voices traveled farther across the fields. The sound of tools returned, the world began breathing again, even the landscape seemed to wake. The frozen streams started moving, the trees showed the first hints of new growth, the air lost some of its sharp winter bite. Nature was beginning another cycle, and for the people who had endured the coldest nights, this change felt almost unbelievable. They had spent so long surrounded by ice that warmth felt unfamiliar, but gradually, the village remembered something important. Winter had never been permanent. The darkness had always had an ending. The cold had always been followed by another season. As the first true signs of thaw appeared, families began preparing not only for spring, but for remembering. Because difficult winters were not forgotten quickly, they became stories, stories told to children who had not experienced them, stories shared beside future fires, stories about hunger, cold, and uncertainty. But also about patience, about courage, about the quiet strength of ordinary people. And soon, the final days of this long winter would pass, the village would step fully into a new season. But before leaving the frozen landscape behind, there was one final thing to understand. The people who survived the coldest nights were not simply survivors of weather, they were survivors of uncertainty, and their story reveals something timeless about humanity itself. The winter finally begins to release its grip, not all at once, not with a sudden change, but slowly, quietly, the way it arrived. The last patches of snow remain beside the village paths. The frozen fields still carry traces of the long months that came before. The wind still has a small reminder of the cold it once carried across the land, but something has changed. The people are no longer waiting only to survive another night. They are beginning to look forward. The fires inside the cottages burn differently now. Not with the same feeling of fear, not with the same careful counting of every piece of wood. The flames are once again a source of comfort rather than a reminder of danger. Families sit together and remember the winter they endured. They remember the nights when the storms surrounded their homes. They remember the moments when food became precious. They remember the people who offered help when there was very little to share. And they remember those who never saw the spring arrive. Because every winter leaves behind stories, Some are stories of hardship, some are stories of loss, but many are stories of quiet strength. The medieval villagers who faced these brutal winters were not heroes in the way legends often describe heroes. They did not defeat the cold with grand victories, they did not control the weather, they simply continued. They woke each morning. They repaired what was broken, they shared what they had, they protected those who needed them, and sometimes, surviving meant doing nothing more than making it to another sunrise. That simple act, continuing despite uncertainty, was its own kind of courage. As spring slowly returns, the village begins rebuilding the rhythm of everyday life. Fields are prepared, tools are repaired, animals return to open spaces, children once again run through places that had been covered in snow for months. The world becomes louder, the silence of winter fades, birds return to the trees, water moves through streams, the earth begins to breathe again. Yet the memory of the coldest nights remains. Years later, when another winter arrives, the people will remember what they learned. They will store more supplies, repair more carefully, prepare more patiently, but they will also remember something less practical, something more human. They will remember that no family survives completely alone. A village is not only made of houses, roads, and fields. It is made of people, people who share warmth, people who offer help, people who stay beside one another when the world outside becomes unbearable. And perhaps that is the greatest lesson hidden inside the coldest medieval winters. The cold tested the body, but kindness protected the spirit. The snow covered the roads, but compassion kept people connected. The darkness lasted for many hours, but even the smallest flame could remind someone that morning would eventually come. So imagine, for a moment, standing at the edge of that medieval village as the last snow melts away. The cottages behind you carry the memories of a difficult season. The fields ahead wait for new life. The wind is softer now. The world feels wider again. And somewhere beneath the earth, beneath the frozen ground that held everything still for so long, life is already beginning again. Because winter, no matter how endless it feels, always has an ending. And perhaps the most surprising thing about those who survived the coldest nights is not that they endured the freezing darkness, it is that after everything they lost, they still found reasons to welcome the light. And when we look back at these forgotten winters, one question remains: if you had stood inside one of those small medieval cottages, with the fire fading, the snow blocking the roads, and the longest night stretching ahead, would you have survived? Or would you have discovered, like those villagers did, that survival was never only about defeating the cold, it was about finding warmth wherever it could be found?